guardate, 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 guardate. Guardate.
A violent winter storm system identified as Cyclone Harry has been relentlessly impacting Sicily and large portions of southern Italy, unleashing one of the most severe January weather events the region has experienced in recent years. Over the last 24 hours, the island has been battered by sustained gale-force winds, intense rainfall, coastal storm surge, widespread flooding, and serious disruption to everyday life as authorities respond to a rapidly escalating natural emergency.
Oh, questa c'è una porta. Sì, guarda.
The powerful storm originated over the southern Mediterranean, fueled by a deep low-pressure system that continues to draw warm, moisture-rich air towards Sicily's coastline. This interaction has created ideal conditions for prolonged torrential rainfall, violent wind bursts, and dangerously rough seas along both eastern and western shores of the island. Rainfall totals in parts of eastern Sicily have approached or exceeded seasonal records, overwhelming drainage systems and saturating soil across urban and rural areas alike. As a result, hazardous conditions have persisted along the Ionian and Tyrrhenian coasts, where waves have repeatedly slammed into shorelines with destructive force. Civil protection authorities across Sicily have maintained the highest level of alert, issuing red weather warnings across vast inland and coastal zones. Emergency services remain stretched as conditions continue to deteriorate, with officials warning residents to remain indoors and avoid unnecessary travel.
Siamo rovinati.
Wind speeds across exposed areas have frequently surpassed 100 kilometers per hour, with peak gusts nearing 120 kilometers per hour in coastal and elevated locations. These extreme winds have toppled trees, damaged roofs, and forced emergency responders into constant deployment as hazards evolve by the hour. Severe flooding has been reported in numerous districts as rivers and streams burst beyond their banks, inundating roads, agricultural land, and residential neighborhoods. Rescue teams have been placed on continuous standby, responding to emergency calls from communities threatened by rising waters. Along the coastline, the impact has been especially dramatic. Massive storm waves, some estimated between 7 and 9 meters in height, have battered piers, promenades, and harbor infrastructure, causing extensive structural damage and overwhelming coastal defenses.
The surge.
What is it?
In port zones, powerful surges have capsized small vessels, torn boats from moorings, and sent seawater surging into adjacent streets. Docking facilities were submerged as waves repeatedly breached seawalls, turning waterfront areas into dangerous flood zones. Storm surge effects have been particularly severe along Sicily's eastern seaboard, where sustained winds and elevated sea levels forced seawater far inland. Entire seaside districts were flooded, damaging infrastructure that had stood for decades and placing historic neighborhoods at risk. Along the coastline, the impact has been especially dramatic. Massive storm waves, some estimated between 7 and 9 meters in height, have battered piers, promenades, and harbor infrastructure, causing extensive structural damage and overwhelming coastal defenses. In port zones, powerful surges have capsized small vessels, torn boats from moorings, and sent seawater surging into adjacent streets. Docking facilities were submerged as waves repeatedly breached seawalls, turning waterfront areas into dangerous flood zones. Storm surge effects have been particularly severe along Sicily's eastern seaboard, where sustained winds and elevated sea levels forced seawater far inland. Entire seaside districts were flooded, damaging infrastructure that had stood for decades and placing historic neighborhoods at risk. In response, local authorities in several towns erected temporary barriers and protective structures in an effort to shield critical facilities and residential areas. However, these defenses have been repeatedly tested by the relentless force of wind and waves, particularly in the Gulf of Catania and surrounding coastal zones. Public works infrastructure and pedestrian waterfronts have suffered significant damage as repeated surges eroded surfaces and undermined foundations. Images circulating on social media show water rushing across quays, foam-covered streets, and residents retreating as the sea advanced through urban areas. The human impact has been widespread and deeply felt. Municipal leaders ordered the closure of schools in more than 100 Sicilian communities, suspending classes to protect students and staff from hazardous conditions. Public offices, parks, and outdoor cultural venues were also closed, while public transportation networks experienced major disruption. Train services between key Sicilian cities were halted where tracks were blocked by landslides or standing water, and major highways were partially closed due to flooding and debris. Maritime transport has been severely affected as well. Ferry services connecting Sicily to mainland Italy, the Illyrian Islands, and neighboring islands were suspended due to unsafe sea conditions, leaving passengers stranded and disrupting essential supply chains. In residential areas near rivers and low-lying terrain, evacuations were carried out as a precaution. Emergency crews assisted hundreds of residents in relocating to safer shelters, including elderly individuals moved from vulnerable care facilities, while civil protection units and volunteers continued round-the-clock efforts to reinforce embankments